You're just in time. We had put the to-do list on the board. All we're doing is going through female reproductive structures. We're going to go through the anatomy, basically the list of things that we're going to see on the models. And then in terms of lecture, we're going to get into the details of the ovarian and uterine cycle. We're going to see how the ovary kind of controls what happens in the uterus. We have a review a week from today, and I can't think any further than that. Zeroing in on exam 5 pretty soon. So like we were talking about in male reproductive system, the testes were the primary sex organ in males because that was the site of gamete production. And in females, we're going to say the primary site or the primary sex organ is the ovary, the site of ovum production. We're going to zoom into that ovary and see what's going on. We even have a model that shows some of the different stages of what's going on in the ovary. And I'm going to attempt to kind of draw this. So I have the ovarian arteries and veins that are delivering hormones to these tissues, like follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We're going to see some of these tissues are developing hormones like estrogen and progesterone. They're going to seep back into the veins and be distributed all over the body. So just for reference, I'll set this over here. And some of the other models I know we saw previously in the semester. So the model, in fact, looks a lot like this diagram that we have on the overhead, where we're looking at kind of a sagittal cut through the female torso. So we can see half of this abdominal wall, and you can see, in addition to the primary sex organ, the ovary, there are a series of secondary sex organs that we said don't produce gametes, but have to house or store, protect these gametes along their journey. And the main theme that we're going to see again is that the female reproductive system has its own strategy for dealing with producing these haploid cells, which aren't like normal body cells, and they have to figure out a way to keep them away from the immune system. So gametes produced here in the ovary are going to end up being picked up by this fallopian tube. It goes by several names: fallopian tube or uterine tube or oviduct. Any one of them you can use. That just describes this tube that hovers around the ovary and picks up those released oocytes. They're going to travel through this uterine tube or fallopian tube. This is typically where fertilization occurs, somewhere along this fallopian tube. And then that fertilized egg is going to travel through the rest of the fallopian tube into this uterus and usually implant somewhere along that uterine wall. When we look at the uterus, we're going to see, and I know this is not the detailed picture, we've seen this before on the models, the parametrium around the very outside, this thick myometrium made out of a lot of smooth muscle, and then the endometrium is the inner lining. We're going to zoom into that endometrium to see the functional layer that's lost every 28 days, and then the basal layer that actually stays there and regrows the functional layer. In fact, the whole regrowing and losing of this endometrium is what happens in the uterine cycle, and that is dictated by what's going on in the ovary. So we'll see how the hormones in the ovary run the show and decide what's happening here in the uterus. We'll see some structures of the uterus, like there's this domed ceiling to the uterus. As I'm paraphrasing, I guess this is going to be called the fundus, kind of like we saw in the stomach. There was a domed ceiling area to the stomach that was the fundus. Then if we get to the tapered distal end of the uterus, there is this projection end of the uterus that sticks into the back of the vaginal canal. That's going to be on the lab list as the cervix. Then we can see the vaginal canal with rugae, again, receives the penis during copulation. We can see urethral orifice. There's I just mixed that up. This is vaginal orifice, obviously. There is the urethral orifice that leads to the urinary bladder. We said in females, there's a much shorter urethra because it has the single purpose of draining the urinary bladder. In males, there was a little more complex urethra because it had the dual purpose of either relieving the urinary bladder or delivering sperm during copulation. You got the class handout from last time, right? Same lab list, same class handout. We're just going through female reproductive stuff. I was just kind of pointing out everything that I could see on the list. We had mentioned, or maybe we haven't yet, we're going to see a structure called the vestibule, which is this area inside the labia minora, which includes the two orifices that we just pointed out, the vaginal orifice and the urethral orifice. To the people that hung out in lab last time, we pointed out some of these things on the female model, and I described how that this vestibule region, and in fact some buildings like a church or larger buildings, they'll have in an entryway this room that they call the vestibule, that there's several hallways that lead off of this one room that's called a vestibule. So this area of the vestibule has these two, what are acting as hallways, basically leading off in different directions. The outside structures that I'm about to point to are collectively called the vulva. This is the external female genitalia. We'll see the vulva as well as mammary glands. And this slide takes us immediately to internal structures. We're starting with the ovary, at least to point out. Also, on the lab list, we can see a couple of structures. Will come back to this picture because this picture shows this broad patch of connective tissue. You can see some of it touching this fallopian tube, some of it touches the ovary. There's blood vessels that run through it. That little tube is the ureter. It's not labeled here, but we just know that as the ureter. This entire fold of connective tissue is going to be something that we call the broad ligament. On the lab models, there are a couple of ovaries that they're shown. So on this model, you can see how they've removed this broad ligament altogether. And on the other one, which is kind of a less detailed ovary, at least they have kept these wing-like structures, which are our only example in lab of this broad ligament. Jumping ahead to the broad ligament. But there are two other ligaments that we need to be aware of in addition to this broad ligament. There's what's called an ovarian ligament, and that's this ligament that connects the ovary to the uterus. So pretty easy to name that one as the ovarian ligament. It's the only ligament that touches the ovary. The other thing that hovers around the ovary, like we said, was that fallopian tube or uterine tube. Then the other round ligament that we see here is actually called the round ligament. It connects the uterus to the abdominal wall. We'll see most of these in lab. Round ligament, ovarian ligament, and broad ligament. But in addition to the ovary, we can see the fallopian tube leading into the uterus. We can see the cervix sticking into the back of this vaginal canal. Here's a cross-section through the fallopian or the uterine tubes. And I don't know if we can make out the detail, but there are little rows of cilia that line these cells that beat in a uniform direction. It's kind of like that escalator of mucus that we saw in the trachea that pulled mucus away from those exchange surfaces and kept them clear, except these cilia are beating in a uniform direction to help this embryo make its way towards the uterine wall. So there's a current that's created by those cilia. What else can we say? I'd mentioned these terms earlier from the side view. Now that we're looking at the uterus kind of in the same way that we would see it on this model, you can see this domed kind of ceiling to the uterus that we're going to call the fundus. There's the kind of triangular shaped body to the uterus, and then we can see the narrowed, tapered end to the uterus that we call the cervix. I don't think your lab list goes to the detail of the cervical canal. There is an external cervical os that leads into the cervix, and then at the back of that cervical canal there's an internal cervical os. I know that we have to know the cervix, at least from the lab list. You can see that sticking to the back of the vaginal canal. What else do we have here? I pointed out the ligaments. Again, broad ligament, ovarian ligament, and round ligament. And thinking of the layer of the uterus that is lost, it's just this functional layer of the endometrium. Beneath that, there's this layer called the basal layer of the endometrium that is kept and constantly sits on top of this myometrium. It's not as detailed in the actual slide, but if we could see a sketch of this, here's the sketch. The basal layer of this endometrium is where you find the base to blood vessels and glands, and these are always retained. What's lost is just this superficial layer called the stratum functionalis. So you get a lot of these spiraled blood vessels that are on the cycle of about every 28 days completely lost and then regrown. And these glands, we can see the tubular parts of the glands are completely lost. The base part of the gland is retained and it has to regrow every 28 days. Vaginal canal, we've talked about that. It has rugae, it receives the penis during copulation. There are kind of the back ends of this vaginal canal are called the fornix. there are these lateral fornixes on either side of the cervix. I think this view, this one, again, it's not labeled here. It's mentioned down at the bottom. Fornix, again, is the back part of this vaginal canal. From this side view, you can see an anterior fornix, which is closer to the urinary bladder, and then posterior fornix, closer to the rectum. We can see that vaginal canal. You can also see from this picture at least two of these structures that are homologous to things that we saw in males. There is this structure called the greater vestibular bulb. In fact, we're going to see that in a slide in just a second. Greater vestibular bulb, that is homologous to the bulbourethra gland that we saw in males. What else? This, again, external anatomy, this diamond-shaped structure that goes, I know we can't see the bones here, but if you can imagine the pubic symphysis, and then the edges of the ischial tuberosities that come together to that coccyx or the tailbone, this diamond-shaped structure is called the perineum. I believe it's one of the things on the lecture list. We can see some of the structures within this perineum. It starts, I'd mentioned this patch of erectile tissue that is homologous to corpus cavernosa in males is clitoris in females. And like the glans penis in males that was protected by a fold of skin called the prepuce, we also see this clitoris is protected by a fold of skin called the prepuce. If we go down from there, we can see just inferior to the clitoris is that urethral orifice and vaginal orifice. This, I can't stick a pin in it. It ended up on the lab list. The word vestibule ended up on the lab list. I'm just telling you, I don't know how I can stick a pin in the vestibule because it just describes this area within the labia minora that includes the entrance or the urethral orifice and vaginal orifice. What else do we see? I have not mentioned labia majora. This is this exterior fold of skin that has hair. It is homologous to the scrotum in males. And then labia minora, this inner fold of skin, is hairless, and it is what kind of protects the vestibule area. We mentioned urethral orifice, vaginal orifice. You can see down there, those are the openings to the greater vestibular gland. In fact, if we could remove the skin and look underneath to the patches of erectile tissue that are found that are homologous to the patches of erectile tissue in males, we said this clitoris in females is homologous to the corpora cavernosa in males, those dorsal patches of erectile tissue. Then we can see the urethral orifice. It is kind of it is flanked on either side by patches of erectile tissue that we used to call the corpus spongiosum in males, but instead of calling it corpus spongiosum in females, it's called the bulb of the vestibule. So there's one of these models over here that shows clitoris, it shows vestibular bulb, and then beneath that is this greater vestibular gland that we said was homologous to bulbourethra gland in males. So these things started out as a similar series of tubes, and depending on whether they were bathed in estrogen or testosterone, they developed differently. But you can still see these homologous structures. Looking at the other external anatomy, these are mammary glands. If we were to look at this transverse cut through the mammary glands, we can see about 15 to 20 lobes. So each lobe, you can see, contains many alveoli. In fact, inside each lobe, it's broken up into tiny lobules, which we can see are containing hundreds of these alveoli. It's inside those little alveoli that's the site of milk production. And then the milk, as it makes its way through these little lactiferous sinuses, it ends up pooling together in those little swollen bulbs. I just mentioned this lactiferous sinus, and then suckling is what squeezes the milk from those lactiferous sinuses out of the nipple. I think there is just a couple of images. No, it's not on the lab list at all. Why? Why do I have that? Maybe on the exam? I don't know. Oh, I know. It's the matching questions that are in the last page of the lecture handout. That is mammary gland structures. Comes from this picture. And there's one of those things that's not used at all, and that's the nipple itself. It's on there as an option for the matching, but I didn't describe it. What's kind of weird about this picture on the overhead is that it's showing an ovary that is simultaneously going through all of these stages at once. And this is not how it would normally happen. You would see just a local patch of cells going through these stages. So all of these stages that we're seeing right here would happen just on one side of the ovary. And it kind of moves around on a cycle of about every 28 days. So I have this little average marker here just to once again stress all the dates that we're putting in here, the time frames are rough averages. But we can average this ovarian cycle out to be about a 28-day cycle. And let's list the phases. In fact, before we go any further, we can see all of these phases on this one picture. So let's just list them and we'll point them out. We know it's 28 days. I've drawn 28 from 0 to 28 on here. So let's just list anywhere from 0 to 4, the first half of this ovarian cycle. We're going to call this the follicular phase. The second half, from day 14 to day 28, we're going to call the luteal phase. And right there in the middle, day 14, again, on average, is where ovulation occurs. Sometimes that's considered this middle phase, but ovulation happens in an instant. We'll describe what's going on there. First, we'll look at the follicular phase and what's going on. When we look at the surface of the ovary, the follicular phase is categorized by these growing patch of follicles. A follicle, like this thing that has been released here, is going to include an oocyte and some cells that surround it. So let me go ahead and draw a tiny follicle. I'll get a couple of different colors here. And I'll try and show that the cell that's right in the middle of this follicle is going to be a diploid cell. Let's just call this the primary oocyte. So the primary oocyte is a diploid cell. It's going to be in the middle of this follicle. A follicle is not just one cell, it's a collection of cells. Let me get a different color. I'm going to draw some of these cells that surround this follicle. These are flat, squamous-shaped cells. I'll just try and stick with a color theme. The purple cells, we're going to say, are epithelial cells. And just to the outside of those epithelial cells are always anchored to some type of connective tissue. So in blue, I'm going to draw some cells that are going to be a type of connective tissue. So far, so good. Now, let's add this little bracket that shows us this entire thing that we're talking about, the primary oocyte, epithelial cells, and connective cells. This whole thing is a follicle, and it has yet to grow. So we're going to call this the smallest follicle, a primordial follicle. Primordial follicles, they have yet to start to grow or stimulate. But on, like we said, about every 28 days, there's going to be a surge in follicle stimulating hormone that comes from these ovarian arteries. This follicle stimulating hormone, if it bathes over these primordial follicles, that's what I like about having this picture up. You can see these follicles exist in clumps. And when follicle stimulating hormone comes down from these arteries, it kind of bathes over several of these primordial follicles. Oftentimes, only one primordial follicle ends up picking up most of that follicle stimulating hormone and is going to go through the rest of these phases. Sometimes in the case of like fraternal twins or where there's two separate, it's not identical twins where you have one embryo that's been fertilized and this same fertilized embryo splits into two identical twins that are genetically identical. In some cases, these non-identical twins, there are two eggs that are released into the fallopian tube. Two separate eggs that are genetically different, and they're fertilized by two different sperms. So you have twins that are not identical. Again, that's why I like this picture. Shows there's a patch of follicles. Sometimes more than one follicle ends up getting enough follicle-stimulating hormone to go through the rest of these steps. Typically, it's just one follicle. And I'm going to, for simplicity's sake, just take one follicle through the rest of these phases. Starts at the beginning with follicle-stimulating hormone hitting this primordial follicle. And we know what that's going to do. It's going to get these follicular cells to divide and grow. So here's what happens when we go from a primordial follicle to, I don't have a lot of room here, but I'm going to draw the next step, what we call a primary follicle. You can start to see on here these primary follicles, they have a layer of cells around them that are cube-shaped. So let's stick with the same colors. I'm going to draw, make that just a little bit smaller. I'm going to try and draw 3 of them in there. Not going to give me a whole lot of room, but I think I can do it. Let's see. So we go from a primordial follicle to what I'm going to try and draw right here is a primary follicle. Then let's see if we can squeeze a secondary follicle in here, and then eventually a tertiary or mature follicle. You'll notice all of these follicles in the follicular phase have a primary oocyte in their center. So that single diploid cell is a primary oocyte the entire time through this follicular phase. What changes are these epithelial cells and the connective cells around the outside. What we start to see, follicle-stimulating hormone. Let's get that follicle-stimulating hormone color in here. As long as this follicle-stimulating hormone is present, it's going to stimulate these epithelial cells and connective cells to divide. I might have to save some space and get those arrows a little bit smaller. But in this next cell, we're going to see these epithelial cells are going to start to form a single layer of cube-shaped cells that surround that primary oocyte. We're going to even start to see these connective tissue cells kind of increase in number. This is a growing follicle. I'm going to label this thing as our primary follicle. So that follicle is that entire collection of cells. We've got these epithelial cells that you can see have changed from flat squamous-shaped cells into cube-shaped cells. As we continue to grow, this, in fact, we're just going to call this thing our secondary follicle and our tertiary follicle. To draw the difference between those, what we really see in a secondary follicle is more than one layer of these epithelial cells. So we'll put nuclei in each of those. We're going to see this connective tissue starts to grow and kind of help protect this growing follicle. This entire collection of cells is our secondary follicle. Let's add something real quick. Since we're seeing these epithelial cells grow and the connective tissue cells grow, that specific type of epithelial cell that I'm growing in purple, those are called granulosal cells. The blue ones, the connective tissue cells, are called thecal cells. Thecal cells and granulosal cells both produce estrogen. So that means at first, at the very beginning part of this follicular phase, there is very low levels of estrogen. Because there really isn't enough of these granulosal cells to start producing it. But what we're going to see by the end of this follicular phase, when we get more granulosal cells and more thecal cells, we're going to have very high levels of estrogen. So estrogen is coming from these granulosal and these thecal cells. In fact, by the time we hit a secondary follicle, what you start to see between these multiple layers of granulosal cells, you'll see these little pockets of estrogen pool up. That's a little pocket of estrogen called antrum. This antral fluid is estrogen. It's a little pocket of estrogen. So again, low levels of estrogen, we don't really see any antral fluid, but when it starts to grow to there's little lakes of estrogen, we end up moving into this third stage of a follicle, what we're going to call a tertiary follicle. It also is called a mature follicle or a Graafian follicle. Let me try and draw this. We'll see a layer of those epithelial cells. Then surrounding that, I'm just going to draw a huge opening here that is surrounded by connective tissue to kind of give it some strength. But what's in this big opening here is just a huge lake of estrogen. These tertiary follicles, they now have so many of these follicular cells, the epithelial and connective tissue cells, that there is just really high levels of estrogen. This entire lake of estrogen, we'll say high estrogen. These really high levels of estrogen are going to basically trigger the next phase of this ovarian cycle. I'd mentioned earlier, these arteries are going to be delivering hormones like follicle-stimulating hormone, and any hormones produced down here in the ovarian tissue, like estrogen, is going to be able to seep back in. So let's maybe draw some of this estrogen, making its way back into these veins. High levels of estrogen are going to get picked back up by the bloodstream. And as they circulate through the bloodstream, we're going to see that the anterior pituitary gland, if it picks up high levels of estrogen, it's going to release that other hormone in this case, anterior pituitary gland, luteinizing hormone. This luteinizing hormone is going to come down only when estrogen levels are high. So before this, luteinizing hormone is basically held off by low estrogen levels, and instead it's encouraged by high estrogen levels. So once estrogen levels pass a crucial threshold, this surge in luteinizing hormone comes down, again on average at about day 14. We'll call this the LH surge. What's kind of interesting is that luteinizing hormone and follicular hormone have been they're continuously produced by this anterior pituitary gland at similar levels. So the whole time follicle stimulating hormone was coming down and growing these follicles for the first 10 days or so, luteinizing hormone was still being produced. It just wasn't being released. It was basically just being stored up. So there's like a wall that prevents the luteinizing hormone from being released even though it's being produced. So there's a buildup of luteinizing hormone for about 14 days, and then high levels of estrogen open up the floodgates, and you get this surge in luteinizing hormone that comes down. In fact, I'm going to run out of room over here, so let's just use this space on the board to write the important things that LH surge accomplishes. There are four. Four things that this luteinizing hormone surge is going to do, and I'll list them and then we'll go over there and try and draw them. The first thing is that it is going to rupture the follicle. This now mature follicle, we can see it houses inside of it one of those diploid cells, the primary oocyte. But what's about to happen, this LH surge is not only going to rupture the follicle, it's going to convert that primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte. It stimulates the first step in meiosis. So we'll say converts primary oocyte, that thing that looked like this, the diploid cell, into a secondary oocyte. Secondary oocytes, let's just draw those in a different color as a haploid cell. Now we know that's not going to look like a normal body cell, so it can't stay on the surface of the ovary. That's when it gets simultaneously kicked off into the fallopian tube. So ruptures the follicle at the same time that it becomes a haploid cell. It wouldn't want to do this before rupturing the follicle. Immune system would get it. So now the third thing that this surge in luteinizing hormone does, after the follicle ruptures, those follicular cells, those granulosal cells and thecal cells, are going to get converted into what we call a luteal cell. So I'm just going to collectively refer to granulosal cells and thecal cells as follicular cells. Those were the cell types present in that growing follicle. So follicular cells converted to luteal cells. These luteal cells are going to kind of have a yellow color, hence their name, luteal cells. It means yellow body. That yellow color comes from cholesterol. And if you remember in a biology class, cholesterol is the precursor molecule to making hormones like testosterone, estrogen, or progesterone. So that yellow color, the high level of cholesterol, tells you that this is an area of tissue that's making lots of things like estrogen, progesterone, maybe testosterone if it was a male, but we're not talking about males now. Follicular cells converted to luteal cells. The fourth thing, kind of what I was just saying, these luteal cells, instead of producing estrogen exclusively like they used to do, they are now going to produce two things. These luteal cells are going to release estrogen and progesterone. I should have made this a complete sentence, and the fourth point would have been that the surge in luteinizing hormone stimulates these luteal cells to release progesterone and estrogen. So estrogen and progesterone are going to come from this luteal body. Let's try and draw that. So all of these purple and blue cells that were follicular cells making estrogen, once this rupture of the follicle occurs, all of these follicular cells are going to get converted into this. I don't have a yellow color, so I'm going to let this represent my yellow color. We'll call this the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum, this big yellow body, we know is going to be producing both estrogen and progesterone. We'll talk about what each of those are doing in just a second. But I'll say if fertilization fails to occur, what just happened, one of the things that happened was the release of this secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. We're going to see, and I know you can't really see the fallopian tube from this picture, but if that secondary oocyte gets fertilized, then this corpus luteum is going to stay functional for the length of that pregnancy. It's going to produce estrogen and progesterone, which is going to keep the functional layer of the endometrium with secretions and nutrients to allow that embryo to grow the full 9 months. However, if fertilization does not occur, then we're going to see the body doesn't want to waste this energy and produce estrogen and progesterone if it's not going to be needed. So this corpus luteum, if fertilization fails to occur, we're going to see it start to shrivel rather drastically in size, and it's going to lose its yellow color. By the end, it's going to be called a corpus albicans, just meaning it's lost its yellow color. It's now white and incapable of producing things like estrogen or progesterone. So at the beginning of this luteal phase, we can see it's basically categorized by high levels of estrogen and progesterone. Barely squeeze it in there. High levels of estrogen and progesterone at first, but then by the end, if that degenerates down to a corpus albicans, now we have low to almost immeasurable levels of estrogen or progesterone. I know I ran off the screen there, but I'm just writing low estrogen or progesterone. So we've now made it all the way through the ovarian cycle. We can see the first half of the ovarian cycle is categorized by what we call the follicular phase, growing follicles, rising levels of estrogen. Those high levels of estrogen are what call for that LH, that luteinizing hormone surge. And that luteinizing hormone surge, we see it accomplishes 4 things. We listed it over there. It ruptures this follicle. I didn't draw it on here, so we're going to have to catch up with some slides. As this follicle ruptures, that primary oocyte is going to get converted into a haploid cell, a secondary oocyte. And we don't draw it on the board anymore because it's been kicked off. Instead, these cells that are on the ovary get converted into those luteal cells, pumping out the mixture of estrogen and progesterone. Before I get any further, let's just go ahead. I'm going to list the uterine cycle phases because there isn't much to draw. It at least will show that what we just mentioned here in the ovary determines what happens down here in the uterus. I think I've left myself enough room. I'll try and match the time frame. So we'll write uterine cycle. This uterine cycle is also about 28 days. Well, instead of writing that, let's just draw it out. Let's draw this 0 all the way to 28. There's our 0. Somewhere in the middle, let's write day 14. So it kind of mirrors this ovarian cycle, except in this first part, we're going to come down to around day 5 and separate this uterine cycle into 3 separate phases. The first phase we're going to call the menstrual phase. The second phase from day 5 to day 14 is the proliferative phase. So proliferative phase is when something is growing or proliferating. Then after day 14, we're going to call this the secretory phase. And let's just describe briefly what's going on in each of those phases. The things that we need to remember about this menstrual phase is you get the loss of that functional layer of endometrium. And the reason you get the loss of the endometrium is because you have no hormonal support coming from the ovary. If we look at what's going on in the ovary, at about day 5, those primordial follicles, there's not enough of these granulosal or thecal cells producing any measurable levels of estrogen. So without that hormonal support, you are losing that functional layer of endometrium. But something happens after about day 5. We now get this growing layer of granulosal cells that start to produce estrogen. So the proliferative phase is not, it doesn't have 0 hormonal support. Instead, we're going to see rising estrogen levels. Rising estrogen is going to cause the regrowing of that functional layer of endometrium. So regrowth of that functional layer of endometrium. And then after day 14, when those follicular cells are converted into luteal cells, you still have the estrogen. Estrogen is needed to maintain this functional endometrium. So if we think about the hormones present in the secretory phase, there is estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen, again, allows the functional endometrium to be present. Progesterone flips the on switch to all of those glands. So secretory phase is categorized by the activation and secretions of those glands in the functional layer of endometrium. We'll say glandular secretions of endometrium. And those glandular secretions, like we said, they continue as long as estrogen and progesterone levels are sufficient. But if fertilization fails to occur and we start to lose estrogen and progesterone levels, if they drop below a crucial threshold, well, then there's nothing there supporting those glandular secretions or even the presence of that functional layer of endometrium. And it starts back with the loss of that functional layer of endometrium. And it doesn't regrow, like we said, until estrogen levels reach high enough levels. So estrogen, regrowth of functional endometrium, progesterone, activation of those glands. Okay, so we got it all out there. Questions about any of my drawings so far before we catch up with our slides? I'll leave it there. We shouldn't have to erase it or draw anything else. Catch up with a little coffee. Let's just look at this thing real quick. So we can see primary follicles. You can see a layer of simple cuboidal epithelium. We know there's rising levels of estrogen. It becomes a secondary follicle when you can see multiple layers of those granulosal cells. Even in a secondary follicle, you start to see those pools of estrogen show up. So that tells us we've got, sufficient levels of estrogen. Here is an even more well-developed follicle. This is approaching the tertiary follicle stage where you've got an entire lake of estrogen. That lake of estrogen is sometimes called antral fluid or antrum. Again, that's just the estrogen being produced by those granulosal cells. When estrogen levels are high enough, the estrogen is seeping back into the veins, circulating through the bloodstream, and is alerting the brain, the anterior pituitary gland, when this follicle is ready for rupture. So when estrogen levels pass that crucial threshold, that's picked up by the blood vessels. And coming also through those same blood vessels down from the anterior pituitary gland is that surge and luteinizing hormone that's going to come down and do those four things. It ruptures the follicle, one. The second thing, as that follicle is ruptured, it releases an oocyte. Not mentioned here, but we know what's happening is just before. That was a diploid cell, and now what's getting kicked off is a haploid cell. Stimulates this primary oocyte to be converted into a secondary oocyte. It's now off the surface of the ovary, away from the immune system. But that's not it. These follicular cells now get converted into luteal cells. So this corpus luteum, the yellow color tells us plenty of raw materials, cholesterol, to make estrogen and progesterone. And we will have estrogen and progesterone moving through the bloodstream as long as that corpus luteum is present. But if it starts to degenerate and lose its yellow color, it loses its ability to make those hormones and becomes a corpus albicans. So that's what's going on in the ovary. You can see all stages in this picture. Shows all stages happening at once in the ovary, but you wouldn't have a big corpus luteum at the same time a follicle is about to rupture. So it's a little misleading. But what I was trying to show in comparison to male gamete formation, we said back when we were talking about males, we said for every one diploid cell that went through meiosis in males, you got 4 sperm out of that. But in females, the process of gamete production, the strategy is a little different because female gametes have to not only contribute the 23 chromosomes, but all of the cytoplasm, all of the organelles. So in order to ensure that one of those gametes that's produced has the best chance at making it, all of the extra resources like the cytoplasm and organelles are all donated to just one of these cells, and the other ones without organelles and without cytoplasm don't develop any further. They're often referred to as polar bodies. We'll see each time one of these cells goes through a stage of cell division in meiosis, one cell gets no cytoplasm, no organelles. The other one gets all of the cytoplasm and all of the organelles. And just to do our name association, primary oocyte, we know that's a diploid cell. But as soon as the primary oocyte is converted into a secondary oocyte, that's a haploid cell. Haploid cells can't stick around on the ovary. They have to be kicked off the surface of the ovary and, in this case, ovulated into the fallopian tube. So what I like about this slide is it shows as soon as the cells become haploid on the surface of the ovary, that's when the follicle ruptures and they're kicked into that fallopian tube. They wouldn't survive on the ovary any longer being a haploid cell. What is not really obvious on here is that this structure is what's ovulated. It's the secondary oocyte. It's a haploid cell. This single haploid cell doesn't go through its second stage of meiosis until after a sperm fertilizes it. We'll probably see this detail on Tuesday. But when a sperm fertilizes an egg, it's fertilizing a haploid cell. That haploid cell, after fertilization, quickly goes through its last stage of meiosis. And again, every time it goes through a stage of meiosis, one of those haploid cells gets no cytoplasm, no organelles, and the other one gets all of the cytoplasm and all of the organelles. So, again, one ovum for 3 polar bodies that are produced. And if fertilization occurs, that corpus luteum, like we said, is going to stay present, pumping out estrogen and progesterone the life of that growing embryo. What else? Over here, what you can see are those follicles. So this side of the diagram is concerned not just with that cell that is either diploid or haploid, it's concerned with the surrounding cells. So this entire follicle, like we said, was made up of epithelial cells and connective cells. Primordial follicles, those cells are kind of squamous shaped. A primary follicle is going to have cube-shaped cells that surround it, cube-shaped granulosal cells. Then a secondary follicle has not one layer, but at least 2 layers of those granulosal cells. You might also start to see little pockets of antral fluid build up in a secondary follicle. By the time we hit a mature follicle, there's going to be a whole lake of estrogen, maybe better shown by this picture right there. Now to a couple of other slides that are, once again, kind of referring to this same picture. We can see on day 1, this follicle-stimulating hormone is higher than it is in the luteal phase. This elevated follicle-stimulating hormone is what's stimulating these follicles to grow and develop. We can see that is what's going on and what I was trying to draw. Growing follicles. As we are in the first 5 days, those follicles are not yet large enough to be producing measurable levels of estrogen, hence the lack of hormonal support in the menstrual phase. But after about day 5, we can see growing follicles, and growing follicles mean rising levels of estrogen. We can see once estrogen levels reach their peak, it ruptures that follicle, so we can see ovulation separating this follicular phase from the luteal phase. And obviously no fertilization occurred here because we have a degenerating corpus luteum. And the other thing, you can see that surge in luteinizing hormone, that doesn't really happen until estrogen levels reach their peak. So it's a way basically for the ovary to tell the brain, okay, this follicle is ready to rupture, ready for that surge in luteinizing hormone. Here are some actual pictures of this. You can see primordial follicles. These are the ones that have squamous shaped cells around their edge. These are not producing measurable levels of estrogen. They actually peak before birth in terms of production number in ovaries. At birth, they're down to about 2 million in number, and at puberty, which is onset around the age of 11 or so, we see these primordial follicle numbers have gone down to about 300,000. And in terms of every 28 days or so, what actually get ovulated throughout the course of your life are about 400 of these secondary oocytes. Secondary oocytes, what gets ovulated. This would be a secondary follicle. We can see more than one layer of cells around the perimeter. This, going to the next picture, this is a primary follicle. We can see a single layer of those cube-shaped cells. So these are all those granulosal cells. They're surrounded by connective tissue cells called thecal cells. Both of them, we said, were producing estrogen. In this growing primary follicle, we can once again see a lot of these granulosal cells producing estrogen. Primary follicle gives way to secondary follicle. And we know growing follicles are growing because they're getting hit by follicle-stimulating hormone, and what they are producing in return is rising levels of estrogen. There's a pocket of that estrogen. We can see now we've entered one of these secondary follicles because there's multiple layers of granulosal cells, and there is enough estrogen that it's starting to pool together in these pockets called antrum. So again, a secondary follicle, we can see these growing pockets of estrogen. When that growing pocket of estrogen grows to, like this huge lake of estrogen, it starts to section off that primary oocyte to one side. This is a mature follicle or a tertiary follicle. It's just about ready to be ovulated. Those really high levels of estrogen we said are seeping back into the bloodstream and are about to call for this surge in luteinizing hormone. So the surge in luteinizing hormone that comes down is going to rupture that follicle. This is a picture, actually, of this whole little white structure is the surface of the ovary. And this is one follicle that has been hit with follicle-stimulating hormone, has grown to a mature follicle. And this is at the moment of ovulation where the surge in luteinizing hormone has come down and is rupturing this follicle. What's being released right there is the secondary oocyte, that first haploid cell. It can't stick around on the surface of the ovary. So there, instead of that being labeled egg, I would feel a little more confident if that was labeled secondary oocyte, the first haploid cell. Maybe I'll change that in the future. But after that ovulation event, all of those follicular cells, all of these red cells here are going to be converted into luteal cells. So here's that luteal structure. The corpus luteum, we know, pumps out estrogen and progesterone. Its name means yellow body, and the yellow color comes from cholesterol. Estrogen and progesterone, both of those are needed in the uterus to allow the presence of that functional layer of endometrium, and then progesterone to stimulate those glandular secretions. Like we said, if that corpus luteum, I'll say it, if the embryo, that doesn't work either. Secondary oocyte that gets released, if that secondary oocyte is not fertilized, then this corpus luteum starts to degenerate into what we call the corpus albicans. It loses that yellow color. It loses its ability to make estrogen and progesterone. And if it loses the estrogen and progesterone levels, then we said there was nothing communicating down here in the uterus to allow that functional layer of endometrium to be present or to continue those secretions. So by the end of this ovarian cycle, the dropping levels of estrogen and progesterone are what stimulate the first phase of the uterine cycle, that menstrual phase where there's no hormonal support, nothing to allow the presence of that functional layer of endometrium. I guess the next few slides, we look at how what we just mentioned in the ovary dictates what happens in the uterus. So there's our three phases of the uterine cycle. Menstrual phase, there's no measurable levels of estrogen coming from the ovary. The proliferative phase, from day 5 to about day 14, we've got rising levels of estrogen. So we know estrogen is going to allow the regrowth of that endometrium. Then after it regrows, the secretory phase, the mix of both estrogen and progesterone, allow the continual growth of that endometrial, the functional layer of the endometrium, but the addition of progesterone activates those secretions. And those estrogen and progesterone are going to need to stay in high levels if that secretory phase is to continue. We lose the hormonal support, we lose that secretory phase. Just going to click it. Yep, there's only a couple more slides. I felt like we were close to the end. And this is just showing, in the uterus, like we said, progesterone levels don't show up until the luteal phase. But estrogen levels, we see them start to rise in the follicular phase. That's what allows, like we said, the regrowing of the functional layer of endometrium. And then those estrogen levels continue into this secretory phase. So the corpus luteum produces both estrogen and progesterone. If it degenerates, you can see sharply both the estrogen and progesterone levels fall off as that corpus luteum is converted to the corpus albicans. So no hormonal support, no secretory phase. And then this is the same thing just with the picture. This is trying to represent the thickness of that functional layer of endometrium. We can see no hormonal support, the loss of that functional layer of endometrium. As that hormonal support starts to increase, as the estrogen levels start to rise during that proliferative phase, we see an increase in the thickness of that functional endometrium. At about day 14, when the regrowth has happened, The secretory phase, we said, has both the estrogen and progesterone to allow the growth to continue as well as those glands to be activated. Just confirming that was the last phase, or the last slide. Those are the three phases of the uterine cycle, and you can see how that overlaps with what's going on in the ovary. So that is the end of our female reproductive PowerPoint. We've got a list of things to see on the lab. Most of them we've seen before, but I've got the models spread out. I'll give you a few minutes to look over your notes or let me know if there's any questions about this, and I'll meet you over at the models.